Some everyday foods have been scientifically linked to cancer risk, yet many people remain unaware of these connections. Peanuts, for example, are often considered a harmless snack, provided to someone who does not have a peanut allergy. Nutritionally, peanuts contain mostly healthy fats, particularly when consumed without added sugars. On the surface, they seem quite benign. However, under certain conditions, peanuts can become contaminated with naturally occurring toxins. Hello, I'm Dr. Mason Clark, and today we're taking a closer look at several common foods and dietary habits that research has associated with an increased risk of cancer. The goal of this discussion is not to create fear around food, but to better understand the science behind these associations and how informed choices may support long-term health. One concern with peanuts involves certain fungi that can grow on them during storage or production. These fungi produce toxins known as aflatoxins. Among them, aflatoxin B1 is considered one of the most potent naturally occurring carcinogens. The International Agency for Research on Cancer, IARC, classifies aflatoxin B1 as a Group 1 human carcinogen, meaning there is sufficient scientific evidence linking exposure to cancer development. The association is particularly strong for liver cancer and gallbladder cancer. Individuals who already have underlying liver conditions, such as hepatitis infections, may be especially vulnerable. Globally, researchers estimate that between 5% and 28% of liver cancer cases may be associated with exposure to aflatoxins. That said, the actual risk varies significantly depending on where someone lives. In highly regulated markets such as the United States, food safety agencies closely monitor aflatoxin levels. The FDA routinely tests peanuts and peanut butter products for contamination. When consumers purchase products from reputable brands and avoid peanuts that appear moldy, shriveled, discolored, or otherwise abnormal, as recommended by the National Cancer Institute, the likelihood of exposure becomes extremely low. Aflatoxin contamination is more commonly seen in regions where food storage conditions and regulatory systems are less controlled. Other foods that can occasionally be affected include corn and certain spices. Now let's shift our focus to vegetables. Vegetables are widely known to reduce the overall risk of many cancers due to their fiber, antioxidants, and micronutrients. However, the picture becomes more complicated when those vegetables are heavily pickled or preserved with salt. Large meta-analyses have identified a roughly 15% higher risk of stomach cancer for every 40 grams per day of pickled vegetables consumed. The most likely explanation is the high salt concentration commonly found in these foods. A similar association has been observed between diets high in salt and increased rates of stomach cancer. Fish is another food often viewed as a healthy alternative to red meat, and in many cases, that reputation is well-deserved. However, the method of preparation can significantly influence health outcomes. Salted fish, such as codfish preserved with large amounts of salt in certain markets, has been associated with a higher risk of nasopharyngeal cancer in some populations. Interestingly, researchers have observed similar patterns with foods like miso soup. Miso itself is a fermented food that contains beneficial compounds, yet many commercial preparations contain substantial amounts of sodium. For this reason, preparing miso at home or selecting lower sodium varieties may be a more balanced approach. These dietary patterns are particularly notable in some Asian populations, where certain salted and preserved foods are consumed more frequently. The underlying biological mechanism appears to involve excess salt damaging the stomach lining over time, which can make the tissue more vulnerable to infection by Helicobacter pylori, a bacterium that naturally inhabits the stomach and is known to be associated with gastric cancer. As with most dietary risks, quantity and frequency matter. Occasional consumption typically carries little measurable risk, while higher and more frequent intake may gradually increase the likelihood of long-term health consequences. Let's move on to alcohol. Many individuals choose to avoid stronger liquors and instead opt for beverages like wine, particularly red wine, which is often perceived as a lighter or even health-supportive option. However, the key factor here is not the type of alcoholic beverage, but the ethanol itself. Alcohol has been classified as a carcinogen, meaning it can contribute to the development of cancer under certain conditions. Although red wine generally contains a lower alcohol concentration than spirits such as Scotch, the total amount consumed over time and individual biological susceptibility remain the most important determinants of risk. Recent research suggests that the relationship between alcohol intake and cancer risk is largely linear. In other words, occasional and moderate intake may carry relatively low risk for many individuals, particularly those without strong genetic susceptibility. However, as consumption increases, the associated risk also increases. Given these concerns, some people choose to skip alcohol entirely and reach for beverages widely considered healthy, such as coffee. Overall, coffee has been extensively studied, and the majority of research suggests that coffee consumption is associated with lower risks of several cancers, including liver cancer and endometrial cancer. However, there is an important nuance worth mentioning. In certain circumstances, coffee may contribute to increased risk of cancers affecting the oral cavity and throat. The key factor in these cases is temperature, not the coffee itself. Studies have shown that regularly consuming beverages hotter than 65 degrees Celsius may damage the delicate lining of the mouth and throat. Over time, repeated thermal injury to this tissue may increase the likelihood of cellular changes associated with cancer. Interestingly, tea, a beverage rarely suspected of having such associations, shows the same pattern when consumed at very high temperatures. In this situation, it is less about the chemical composition of the drink and more about the heat exposure to the epithelial tissue in the oral cavity and throat. Next, let's discuss a group of foods where the evidence is less definitive, but where research suggests a plausible biological mechanism that warrants caution. One example involves a compound known as acrylamide. Acrylamide can form when carbohydrate-rich foods are cooked at very high temperatures, particularly during frying, roasting, or baking processes that produce browning or burning. Foods such as French fries, potato chips, and heavily toasted bread can contain varying amounts of acrylamide when cooked aggressively. For this reason, it may be helpful to avoid making deep-fried foods or heavily burnt items a regular staple of the diet. Even foods that are generally considered healthy, such as poultry or fish, can present issues if they are cooked at extremely high temperatures, especially when grilling leads to visible charring. In fact, surveys indicate that nearly 80% of Americans are unaware of the link between heavily charred meats and cancer risk. When animal proteins are exposed to very high heat, certain chemical reactions occur within the muscle tissue. These reactions can form compounds known as heterocyclic amines, HCAs, which have been shown in laboratory studies to have carcinogenic potential. Additionally, when fat and juices from meat drip onto open flames during grilling, the resulting smoke can produce another group of compounds called polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, PAHs. These substances may then settle onto the surface of the food as it cooks. Fortunately, several practical strategies can help reduce the formation of these compounds when cooking meat. One effective approach is marinating meats before grilling. Marinades rich in herbs and spices contain antioxidants that can significantly reduce the formation of harmful compounds during high-heat cooking. Ingredients such as rosemary, garlic, and turmeric have demonstrated particularly strong antioxidant effects in this context. At the same time, it is wise to avoid marinades that contain large amounts of added sugar, as these can contribute to excessive browning and potentially increase unwanted chemical reactions. Instead, marinades that include citrus juice or vinegar may be beneficial. Their naturally low pH can help slow the formation of certain carcinogenic compounds. Another helpful technique is to partially cook larger cuts of meat on the stovetop or in the oven before finishing them on the grill. This reduces the total time the food is exposed to open flames, which in turn lowers the chance of excessive charring. Cooking at moderate temperatures, choosing leaner cuts of meat, and trimming visible fat before grilling can also reduce flare-ups and smoke production. As an additional precaution, if charred portions do form during cooking, simply cutting away those burnt sections before eating can further minimize exposure. Finally, many people wonder about dairy and its potential relationship with cancer. That is a complex topic with a large body of research and several nuanced findings. We explored that subject in detail in a separate discussion. So if you're interested in learning more about the current scientific understanding of dairy and cancer risk, be sure to check out that video next. I'll see you there.